if you are kind of heading for difficulty, start trying to think about how you can manage, whether it's move in with someone else and rent out the property, whether it's Airbnb a room, get a boarder in, or start talking to your bank about what they can do to support you over that period.
And that's where I think it's always thinking outside the box, because it's not just about looking at your spending, it's looking about your income as well. But it may be also looking at other income streams as well, just to help you through.
Welcome to Slice, Property Made Possible. We're a platform on a mission to reduce barriers to home ownership. This podcast is a safe space for our community to learn together and build the confidence required to start on their property journey. When you're ready to start, head along to slicetobuy.com and sign up for your free dashboard. Welcome back to another episode of Slice. Today we have a former colleague of mine and Chief Economist of ASB, Nick Tuffley.
Hello, kia ora. Thanks
for coming, Nick. I'm super excited. We're just saying before the episode aired, it's been a while since we've caught up.
Yes,
and
it is.
Yeah, Slice has come some way since there, and the economy has come some way since too.
Yeah, perhaps Slice has been going up a bit more than the economy has, fair to say.
We'd like to think so, Nick. We'd like to think so. Hey, we start off our episode with a question around your first home purchase. So what can you remember about that?
Well, mine was a home in Brooklyn, in Wellington, not New York.
Brooklyn.
And it was about a 1906 working cottage, and when it popped up, I could actually see some photos of it looking quite forlorn because it was all by itself back in those days where there was just a slope and a house on it. So very old house, very, very drafty. I had to buy a big, massive gas heater that barely kept one room warm. It was just leaking so much heat. But first house.
You got to get in somehow.
Yeah.
And so what sort of area in your life was that? What were you doing at the time?
Yeah, I was in my early 30s. So by that stage, I'd been working for probably only about 6 years or so. But fortunately, back in that time, without trying to show my age, it was before we'd had some of the massive price booms. So it was, reasonably affordable. I mean, it was a 10% deposit that I put down at the time. It had a bed sit underneath it to help create a little bit of income, and that's what made it affordable for me at that age.
Perfect. So did you kind of seek that out, or you just saw the opportunity to potentially rent out that bottom area?
Well, out of all the houses I looked at, there was a variety. Some had income, some didn't. And it was about just making the sums work for me at the time, because your first mortgage always feels so big and uncomfortable. And for me, having that extra income just made it work. I would have spent a lot less. So for me, I was able to buy a house of greater value, but it was probably leveraging up a bit more than what I ordinarily would have.
Yeah, knowing that you can service it because you've got the income, a piece that you can rent out. And you can also do things like Airbnb now as well, or get boarders, and we know the banks look at what that boarder income can be now as well.
Yeah, well, I have to say it was slightly before Airbnb, but the internet had been invented.
Oh, that's amazing. You've given us a really good band to work with, Nick. Cool. And I think one of my most passionate topics is actually economics. So I studied law and economics, and obviously worked with you for a time at the bank. But I thought it might be worthwhile jumping into what exactly it is about economics that impacts housing. So probably a good place to start would be with interest rates. Obviously, we have the Reserve Bank of New Zealand that uses monetary policy to change the official cash rate, and then we see changes to the interest rate. Can you give us a little bit of a basic sort of economics 101 on how that sort of can impact the housing market?
Yeah, well, there's so many things that drive the housing market, and I think that the really key one is people. That's why you have a house. It's to live in or to rent out to someone to live in. So population growth is going to be a key driver of housing market. It's going to be influencing how much new construction you need. And often it will be putting a bit of pressure on house prices, more particularly the land underneath a house. So I guess the bigger a city gets, the more a premium there is for being closer to the centre of the city, the more expensive that land generally gets. So that's a really key.
We're definitely sort of seeing
starter.
That in Auckland as well.
Yes, you are. And then, of course, income growth as well. So population, income growth will tend to be the things that drive things over the longer term. And interest rates is quite a cyclical one most of the time. So when interest rates are high, obviously, that mortgage becomes big, the ability to borrow and buy just isn't there. So when you go through the interest rate cycle, that has quite an impact on just the state of the housing market at that time. And just one thing over the last 30 years is interest rates have actually had a very big impact on house prices as they've gone from a very, very high level. So way before both of us were born, sort of back in the 1980s.
Inflation Don't group me with you, Nick.
Way before you were born, way before I was born, I'd like to wish. But back in the 1980s, high inflation, extremely high interest rates. And what you saw happen was interest rates have structurally fallen since the late 1980s, probably about as low as they'll really go in recent years. And as interest rates have gone down, house prices have actually gone up, kind of as a multiple of our incomes as well. So there's been the structural driver of lower interest rates, meaning that you can borrow more for a given income, and that's contributed to
more people being able to buy houses.
Yeah. So it's like the yield, the yield has gone down, the price has gone up. So we've had that impact over the last few decades.
But what's really interesting about what you've kind of said there is, yes, interest rates are a factor, but there's these other factors that are potentially more important over the long term. So we're all sort of hearing about interest rates, we're experiencing the pain that comes with that. So it's really front and center right now. But actually there are some other trends like population growth and demand that sort of are probably more pressing over the long term and also support the housing market over the long term.
Yeah, so I'm going to use that cliched economics thing, which we both learned, demand versus supply. So and that is often what it comes down to. And the other thing when you look at housing in New Zealand is that supply capability is sometimes quite slow to come through. So we haven't been very good at building houses very quickly or necessarily building enough houses for sustained periods of time. So you can have a supply shortage, particularly in places where you've got strong population growth. And that can really sort of turbocharge that sort of house price cycle for a period.
Yeah, and we're sort of seeing it, the after effects of the COVID lockdown as well there in terms of supply. I know my auntie and uncle, they've been building out in Waihi, and a lot of those materials that were going to be available haven't been, and that property, the building of that property has been delayed by, close to a year. So we're seeing a shortage of also the resources and the things we need to import to build as well, and that then makes the cost to build more expensive, which again puts pressure on the house prices.
Well, it's been stunning in that sort of post-lockdown period just how rapidly the cost of building a house went up. So the materials, globally there were shortages of materials, and here in New Zealand all the cliche stories around Fletcher's not being able to build plasterboard fast enough to meet the market, and labour shortages as well. So it was stunning how rapidly the cost to build went up. But that's still happening to some degree at a time when house prices are coming down. So certainly in that development market, you've got what you're selling going down in price potentially, and it's costing you more to make. So I think things like that do have quite an impact on that whole construction sector and, create delays, whether it's people just can't find the materials or now choose to delay things, or whether people are actually a lot more cautious about whether now is the right time to be embarking on a development.
Yeah, so there is, I guess we're acknowledging there is a bit of a supply issue in New Zealand, and that's one of those factors that is going to continue to influence housing. Because the other thing that, just thinking back to COVID, we weren't expecting necessarily, house purchases to go up during that period. But of course, again, it comes back to people, as you said. We started seeing people jump into the market because all of a sudden they work from home, they want that space, they want to be in their own kind of space as opposed to a small in the city, dwelling or rental.
Yeah, there were so many things that influence what happened with the housing market. So, what you're talking about there is that lifestyle change where we decide, okay, we want to work differently, which means we can live differently. So maybe we go out of the city, get a lifestyle block or live near a beach, and we don't commute into town nearly as much is one thing. Also, we shut a whole lot of people away from being able to go overseas. There's a lot of people with money going, well, I want to still have some fun, and they may have bought a holiday home, or looking at the very low interest rates we had at the time and going, gee, I don't really want to have my money in the bank at a low interest rate, I'll go and buy some investment property. So many things like that happened at the same time.
Yeah, that's a really good one. I didn't think about that, but when it comes to migration and population growth, a lot of the buyers are often kind of New Zealand buyers as well. And that seems to create real pressure on demand. And of course, if those New Zealanders were kept in New Zealand and didn't have that opportunity to go and throw their money toward travel or other, other enjoyable experiences, then I guess that would have been a big factor that influenced that.
I think it certainly was an influence because we couldn't go and travel, we couldn't go out and do other entertainment. So we tended to look at, we would go on holiday and maybe buying a holiday house was a great idea, or getting a bigger holiday through that time. So it was amazing. We had a really sharp housing boom at a time when the border was closed. So all the cliched, it's all the migration flowing in, causing added demand. That wasn't there. We changed our demand habits for a variety of reasons. And you certainly can't rule out having interest rates where you could get a mortgage at nearly down to 2%. I mean, it was almost too cheap not to borrow money in a sense. I mean, particularly if you stacked it up against renting. At that time.
And then, of course, renting can be a bit of a lagging factor, though. So, whilst perhaps now you could argue rent is cheaper than some mortgages, it does tend to be a lagging thing where landlords then sort of gradually increase that rent, right?
Well, I think it can. I think what we tend to find is that rents, probably the really binding thing on how high rents can go in general is just how much of a share of income it's taking out of people's pockets, because it gets to a point where people simply can't really afford a rent increase. So we do find that that's quite binding on there. But certainly at the moment there's a lot of pressure on landlords where they're going. My interest rates are going up. My interest rate, at least perhaps up until this election, has been fading. My rates are going up quite dramatically. My insurance costs are going up quite dramatically, and trying to pass that costs on. But it does come down to what is happening in that rental market, just the supply and demand of rental properties as well. And that's been pretty fluid because there's been so many influences, regulatory changes that have discouraged people from perhaps remaining as a residential property investor renting out their property.
Yeah, and that may change now that we've got national and government as well. So what are you expecting, for renters from that?
Well, I think one of the significant changes is going to be the reintroduction of being able to
get your interest
rate deductibility in place, which does put it back in line with pretty much any other investment purpose. So it's sort of, the tax treatment was all lined up. I think we've just got the perception or the ability that you can gear up more against property. So that will come in. That's likely to see more residential property investor interest come back in. Now, what does that mean for people entering in the housing market? Look, that probably means that if you're a first home buyer, again, you're back to competing with investors to a degree. At the same time, we've probably been in a rock and a hard place where we've had some people where the residential rental market's been quite tight, but they can't afford to buy their own property and they're left struggling to find a place to rent. So, we do need private sector landlords. The majority of rental properties are owned by the private sector, so it's an important role in providing rental property. So that's probably a key thing, encouraging a bit more residential property investment. Where we go with some of the tenancy law changes and the sort of swing around, the sort of landlord rights versus tenant rights, I haven't really seen any clear indications of what might happen around that, but there'll be another space to watch, because we're trying to strike a balance between giving tenants lots of rights, perhaps a bit of certainty. One of the things in New Zealand that we're not good at is giving sort of long-term sort of rental agreements, which gives people a bit more certainty. But at the same time, you've got landlords who have got a lot of money invested in property, and they do want that to be looked after as well, and there to be that incentive for tenants to look after it.
Yeah, definitely. One of the property developers that we had on recently, we spoke about how he was actually buying some properties that weren't livable and the bank wouldn't lend toward. So, and then doing those up and selling them to first home buyers. So that it also comes back to that housing stock and what's available for renters. And actually, you could look at that and say, oh, well, this investor is making all this money off housing, but actually your average first home buyer couldn't potentially get the funds to go and buy that property because it's not up to standard. And it's not, able to be readily lived in by renters either.
A really key thing is, look, we just need to have enough homes full stop for people. And I think particularly a part of the market where we are missing, the social housing part of it, we've been lagging, we've got to catch up, we've got long waiting lists there. But just for sort of everyday people who can't quite afford their own house, or maybe don't want to buy their own house, sort of a good stock of healthy, livable homes is really important. And it does take investment, and someone's got to do it. I mean, if we are going to sort of try and steer private investors away from doing it, then it means that the onus and the obligation increasingly comes on the government, and it's having to pour capital into, say, providing homes where someone else could, instead of perhaps putting more money into hospitals or education or roads, because the government's not a sort of bottomless pocket that can spend on things. So it's kind of
it's
set
a
in the
challenge.
it is, and you sort of want to incentivise property investors to help with that supply thing as well, and so as well as keeping rents, affordable too.
Because I've been, I'm passionate about housing and have been for a long time. I did take a look under the hood at politics for a short time, and
You topped out?
Yeah, I topped out. And I think the challenge, it was underwhelming what's been achieved. It is underwhelming what's been achieved in the housing supply space by government. So I do think there needs to be, a mixed model approach, and we have to potentially, support, whether that's investors or whether, because this is an interesting one, it's easier to borrow for a pre-existing house or potentially a new build than it is for a piece of land to then go and build on that. So, potentially there's some opportunity for the banks to innovate in that regard.
There could well be. I'm not the best expert in lending, because I have to confess, the amount of new loans I've approved for residential is about zero. But look, we do want to make that process, I mean, as easy as possible. And I think from banks' point of view, is you sort of know, that degree of having, you need some degree of security over what you're lending on, so to be that the section and the sort of and it's perhaps how you structure some of those construction loans to make that a little bit easier,
more appetizing perhaps. But I mean, what's interesting, you've sort of leaned in there with some feedback around, actually there's also a criteria and there's a risk appetite, and that's important for us to maintain and keep a stable economy too, because if we do go and relax the lending criteria, then we could end up in a GFC kind of, in a crisis as we've seen overseas. So what do you think about what the bank has been doing? I know, for example, they generally assess sort of 2% above what the current interest rate is, and how our economy has benefited or looks different to some of those international economies as a result. Yeah.
Well, I think banks in New Zealand are required to sort of take care of their customers and be prudent lenders. So like a really important part about that is not lending money to people who can't afford to pay it back with sort of a very high likelihood. And that's where we saw so much trouble coming through in 2008, 2009 overseas. It was lending being done to people who just quite frankly couldn't pay it off, and no one in the whole chain had an incentive to sort of really do a lot of due diligence. So it's an important aspect. You want to set people up to succeed and meet their financial goals, and that's what we're all about, is the sort of well-being and progress of New Zealanders. So when banks do lend money, they do have a test rate, which you could probably say a rough rule of thumb is usually somewhere around about 2% above the floating rate, sort of give or take. Sort of ours is in the high 8% mark, and the idea behind that is, look, you're lending money to people. If interest rates or whatever level they're at go up sizably, it's giving a pretty good indication those people will have the servicing capacity there. Now, the smashed avocado on toast might have to be and the avocado
Nick.
might be Marmite. But
you can't save that much just by getting rid of avocados.
No, but I think probably just the point I make is look, we if you look back over the last couple of years, you've had people transition from a low 2% loan to, say, a 7% loan over a period of time, and it's not fun. We were stress testing people at roughly around about 6.5%, even when rates were low. That was a big buffer. But you sort of think about what people have had to go through, where you've had your interest rate payments alone potentially doubling, and the lifestyle changes you have to make just to make sure that you can pay that mortgage. It's a lot of pressure. We've been through an unusual time, but I think when you look back, at the time having quite a conservative stress testing interest rate, saved a lot of people from hardship.
Yeah, I think that everyone was expecting kind of the house prices to, absolutely bottom out. And I don't think that they have, anecdotally, from what we've seen in market. One reason being the supply issue that you said. Actually, people have just said, okay, well, I won't list my property then if I'm not going to get what I'm hoping for. But the only reason that they've been able to do that is potentially because some of that stress testing was in place. Imagine if you were testing at even only 4 at the time, which would have been that 2%, threshold above 2%. We might have seen, a lot more people defaulting, but it doesn't seem like there's a great amount of that occurring at the moment. It might be that people are just holding on, and are we expecting them to be able to drop off, or are you kind of confident that stress test has probably been pretty robust, particularly when you compare sort of our lending processes to something like the GFC?
Well, I think it's ensured that the vast majority of, it'll be particularly new borrowers, I sort of look at it, people who took on a mortgage in, say, the second half of 2020 and a fair chunk of 2021, particularly through to mid-21, that's where interest rates were at the lows, and house prices were still, near their peak. They sort of peaked late 2021. So there's a sort of, say, an 18-month window in which if people bought in that period or substantially took on more debt during that period, those are the people who are more vulnerable. It's a relatively small pocket when you think about, just the number of houses that would have been sold during that time, and only a proportion of those people being, relatively heavily geared. But it does mean those people are facing quite a bit of pressure.
I believe I'm in that pocket.
Yes.
So I bought my first property, it would have been around 21. I bought in Raglan. I did split the mortgage though, so I put half of it on kind of a long-term fix, and then the other half came off sort of beginning of this year. So that climbed probably just before the interest rates really started kind of moving into that 4 or 5 though, so I still got it at a pretty good level. And then I bought again, and that interest rate is around sort of 5%, and we've fixed out to 5 years, and I'm geared quite massively at the moment as a result, but I have sort of got renters in to one of those properties. And I think that's the thing, you kind of can manage as long as you've got an income and you've got the ability to get, to fill and service that property. So for someone who has taken on a lot of lending over that period, I think I'm sitting at about, 1.2 personally. I guess I'm just sharing that to say I'm not overly uncomfortable at the moment despite that. So I think it does become that kind of, if interest rates continue to climb over the next period, then yeah, I'm going to be in for a lot of hurt. But it is like, how long can you ride it out?
Yeah, and look, I think there's a few things that sort of came to mind as you're talking through that. I mean, and one is that the things that you can adapt and do differently. So it's the changing your spending habits, say bringing in people, boarders or renters, and to increase income, are ways in which you can get through it. And the other thing also is if anybody is actually getting into a lot of financial difficulty, get along and talk to your bank. The sooner you kind of realise you're in a challenging situation, start having those discussions, because the sooner you do it, the more options there are open, because everybody wants to stay in their homes, and so it's looking at what can be done, like even if it's going on to interest only for a period of time, which at least means you're not having to make the capital payments, as some examples of.
Yeah, and the bank is more likely to do that if they know you are in trouble, because it doesn't help anyone. It's not great for the brand either, is it, when you sort of say, hey, we have to sell your home. That's not what anyone's looking for. So that's a really good call out, is that if you are kind of heading for difficulty, start trying to think about how you can manage, whether it's move in with someone else and rent out the property, whether it's Airbnb a room, get a boarder in, or start talking to your bank about what they can do to support you over that period. Because, for example, we're actually going to Whangamata over the holidays, and
very nice.
We're very lucky to be able to do this, but my partner, his family have a batch there. So we're going to be staying there, and we will save 10 grand over that period by Airbnb-ing our property out of Auckland. So there are not everyone has those resources or those opportunities, but you have to find out what are yours, what can you do to kind of make things work and help you on that financial journey.
Yeah, and that's where I think it's always thinking outside the box, because it's not just about looking at your spending, it's looking about your income as well. And that could be related around the property itself. As you've given a great example of how to make money and have a great holiday at the same time. But it may be also looking at other income streams as well, just to help you through. And I think the other thing from my point of view, like I always find that, predicting the future is, quite challenging. It's slightly more difficult than predicting the past.
That's pretty much your job, isn't it, Nick?
It is. So sort of like in a very sort of general sort of outlook from here, you go, look, the sorts of levels of interest rates we're experiencing at the moment, we won't see indefinitely. Obviously my team's job is to try and figure out when they're going to come down, which it still looks like it will be some time. But the thing for people to bear in mind is look, this is not where things are likely to stay. There's likely to be some relief going through in the future. So it's kind of a matter of just riding through this.
And over that period,
cycle,
trying to increase your income, trying to manage and as best you can.
Yeah. And I think probably another thing we also should remember is if you took out a mortgage 2 or 3 years ago, you were probably rolling off somewhere around about a 3. Not too long ago, you probably could have been even under 3, like a month or two ago, if you're looking back at 2 or 3 years. But also over that period, people's incomes have also gone up. And yes, we've got the cost of living crisis chewing up a chunk of that, but it's not chewing up, or won't be chewing up all of that. If you've got a mortgage and you've got a lot of mortgage payments, a fair chunk of your income is actually going into paying your mortgage, not into your living costs. So you've probably had your wage increases that have helped actually cover your day-to-day living costs and perhaps left a bit spare to pay for the mortgage as well. So something we've also got to remember is that we've had strong wage growth coming through, and much stronger than what we normally see, and that helps. And weirdly enough, when we look at the average mortgage rate that people are paying at the moment, where it will get to, the sort of average share of household income that will go towards servicing debt, it's kind of getting back to a marginally above long run average level, which is a sort of way of saying that overall, the household pressure is not that great, but there's two things in there. One, just the huge change in a short period of time because the interest rate increases have been so savage. And of course, there are those pockets of people who will be much more exposed than others as well. But look, I do think fortunately it's a relatively small pocket.
Yeah.
But
not fortunate for that pocket, but for the economy and our ability to actually support that pocket as well. Because if everyone's falling apart at the seams, then it becomes very difficult for everyone to support, or for even government to step in because they can't support everyone. So, if it is just a pocket, that just means that, our economy is in a better place potentially. What are you seeing when it comes to the economy and changes in house prices? Because you mentioned earlier that they have been decreasing. That's been the narrative for a while now. But anecdotally, we're seeing a lot of our customers find there's not enough listings in market. And as a result, properties are going for 400, 500K more than expected.
So look, we are starting to see the early signs that the housing market has bottomed out. So prices fell about 16% from the peak in late 2021 to the sort of early parts of 2023. Big. It's bigger than what we saw during the financial crisis. And when you look at it, adjust it for inflation, to look at what real house prices have done, it's a pretty substantial fall. So a long fall compared to our incomes and compared to what inflation's done. So the good things are the amount of stock on the market starting to come down. That's because the sales have started to pick up. For a long period of time, the new listings coming onto the market just dried up. People increasingly realise, this is not a great time to sell, so we just won't sell. We don't need to. We'll just hold off. So that whole supply side on the market started to come down. You're seeing it's taking less time to sell a home as well. So all the good signs are there. Homes are selling a bit quicker. Listings have become a little bit more scarce because people have been listing their homes. Sales are picking up and their prices are picking up. And I think there's a few key factors in there. Just the population growth has actually been surprisingly strong since late last year. Like the migration flows have been astonishing.
Odd percent.
Yeah, well, we've got about 200,000 people coming in, about 100,000 people leaving.
Yeah, so it's like net 104,000 or something.
Yeah, so it's extreme on both sides, but ultimately that means there's all of a sudden a whole lot more people who need somewhere to live, and so that's putting that sort of fundamental demand pressure on the market. So that's a really big factor. Also, when the Reserve Bank signalled, okay, we think we're done with interest rates back in May, and that's given people a little bit more confidence that if they buy now, they're not going to suddenly find that rates are 1%, 2%, 3% higher again in a few years' time, which is the experience that people have found over the preceding couple of years. So I think that's helping as well. So there's that sort of cliche, people don't like to catch a falling knife, so everybody likes to wait until it hits the kitchen floor and then they're quite happy to sort of jump in. And that's sort of a bit where we've been. And I think with the election outcome, it's got that potential to encourage a few more investors back into the market as well.
Yeah, definitely. We did hear from sort of a lot of people in the market that they would be diving back in should National get in. So we do expect that that's going to create some pressure as well. And when it comes to, I guess, the changes in pricing, and yes, that has been rapid, down to 16%. Do you think that might recover in larger amounts, or might it be at, for example, in Auckland, the 6% year on year? What are you sort of expecting in terms of recovery? I know you don't have a crystal ball, but...
Well, I traded in for a bowling ball because at least it was more useful in social events, and it was about as transparent. Look, we do think there'll be a reasonable squeeze in prices that comes through. I think in the short term, it's still going to be a bit of more of a grind higher than anything, but we do see the momentum starting to pick up a bit more next year, and then particularly once interest rates do come down as well. So that population growth at a time when, look, building activity looks like it's softening, so that new supply coming on the market is potentially just slowing a little bit. So we do think there'll be a bit of pressure coming through. But obviously that's just a view, and we've all got to be careful that we don't go and try and make money out of an unrealised imaginary capital gain quite yet.
We won't hold you accountable. And we do have a disclaimer at the end that says, this is not financial advice. But yeah, you've moved into that capital gains piece, which is what, are people looking at different strategies now, or should they be looking at different strategies? Because if that is a bit of a grind and it takes a while for that capital gain to be realised, potentially, rental yield or getting a property that you can cover with rent and service effectively might be a better strategy for some.
I think we've always got to bear in mind is that cash flow is king. It is the cash flow that pays the mortgage. So fundamentally, I think you've got to make sure that the figures stack up so that your cash flow position is going to be comfortable, and obviously any pending tax changes will make that easier. Now, I sort of look at capital gains as something they're a bonus, but they're not something. We love
them in New Zealand.
We do love them, and we have for years. Back when I was at university, 10 years ago or so, the investment advice essentially, if we went in and wanted to, the university student, figure out, well, how do I make money? It was basically buy a house for $40,000 with
put it on interest free
$4,000 deposit. Wait a year until it's gone up to $44,000. Borrow another $4,000 and buy another house. I mean, I'm kind of showing my age a little bit there, but that was an old book, I stress. But it just sort of shows, there's that. I think we've long had a fixation with the capital gains out of property. I think we've got to think about what might be different this time around. So 70s and 80s, high inflation, and particularly the 80s, that helped a lot. 70s was a sort of decade of two halves, massive boom in the first half. Prices went nowhere for about 5 years after that, in a high inflation environment, so they basically lost purchasing power. But then the 1980s carried things on up. Then we went into that period of falling interest rates, so the ability to service a bigger mortgage, pay more for a house started to kick in. So that whole global thing where asset prices went up as yields and interest rates went down. Story. So we had that structural change.
Just to sort of simplify that for some of our listeners, basically that's just, houses and things that you can borrow against. The price of those went up because the lending was so cheap. Yeah,
in a way, like one way to look at it is like if a third of your income in the 1980s in a high inflation environment went towards servicing your mortgage, you were probably paying about 3 times your income to buy the house. In a third of your income, now you're into a period where you're probably still spending a third of your income, if not more, but the multiple of your income that you can now borrow and that you're now actually paying is much higher. So quite a few structural drivers. I think when we're going forward now, what we've got to think about is okay, what's more fundamentally going to start being the drivers? And I think it's going to be going back to the population growth in particular areas, that income growth story that I talked about before, because generally if you've got decent population growth, good income growth, that really helps in terms of just driving up the scarcity or the value of land, and the income means you can afford more. And we've got to talk about regulation, because I think that's going to be one of the things that it's made a difference over the last 30 years, and I think we've also got to think about, well, how might that change or not, and what that might mean about any sort of ability for us to build homes and supply homes, cheaper homes, quicker. Well.
Yeah, hopefully that will be an enabler regulation in that regard. I think I've been sitting here sort of thinking, pulling thoughts together from a few of the episodes that I've had and just now. And I mean, so we're talking about that population growth coming in, migrants being a massive part of that. Spoke to Professor Paul Spoonley. He said that actually when it comes to migrants, a lot of them are interested in new builds. So if you are looking to buy a property and you're not sure what capital gains they're going to do, interest rates are relatively high, you potentially want to invest in a property and you want to be able to service that property, there's an argument to say that, yeah, you potentially should be looking closely at rental yield, the ability to get tenants in and service that if the interest rate starts to increase, or, you know, even just to service the interest rate as it is today. And potentially a new build is a good opportunity to do that with all of the migration that's occurring.
Yeah, and I think the thing about buying a new build also is that the maintenance is likely to be low. You've usually got a builder's guarantee for a fair period as well. It can be perhaps hard to seek out ways to add value because you're buying something new, you're not going to suddenly be overhauling it, whereas you do see some experienced property investors where they'll be able to go, okay, look, I can put another 2 homes on here, or I can add a bedroom or do something and increase the overall yield. You've got to really understand what you're investing in. And also your own
sort of risk appetite and circumstances. But yeah, I mean, both of my properties are neither are new builds. So I have gone more in the capital gain space and trying to get freehold land because we know that can perform quite well over the longer term. But I just think it's really interesting in this climate to sit back and the gains aren't happening the same as they have. Interest rates are higher, you want to be able to service the loan, and we've got migration that are apparently interested in new builds. You know, it's going to depend on what your appetite is and whether you've got a short-term goal, a long-term goal, whether you want to live in the property or not. But it's really interesting to think about some of those themes coming through.
Yeah, and look, I think when I think about property, and in many ways, I think you need to think about it as a long-term investment because it's a very liquid asset, really. You know, you think about it, it takes a long time to sell. You can't just ring up a share broker and dump your share portfolio in 5 minutes. And there's a big cost, you know, of selling it as well. So it's generally a sort of long-term thing. And I do think over the long term, you know, we are still likely to see the sort of real value of property go up over time if we've got a country where in general population is growing and our incomes keep going up. I think what we need to think about is that role of regulation, because we've had 30 years of the Resource Management Act and also councils wanting to, I guess, contain the urban boundaries out of a view that if they do that, they're not having to fund so much infrastructure and you can, you know, encourage more public transport, etc.
So you're sort of talking medium density housing or building up?
Yeah, so if you're doing a lot of that or constraining the supply of readily available land to build on, you can be artificially constraining the supply of land and push up all land prices. So we've got some trade-offs.
Because then people go, well, I'd quite like a bigger section, you know, freehold land with a backyard and a pool or whatever. Yeah. I mean, I think
it costs to do that a lot. So we've got some sort of trade-offs like that, sort of trying to contain urban sprawl. It does put up in general that sort of price on that land. So your existing homes, unless they get subdivided, you know, they will be going up in value and in cost. But also you start to see, okay, well, look, land is more valuable. We need to make sure we're using it more carefully. So that sort of puts into that argument of, you know, a lot more, you know, increasing the density in areas. But we do have trade-offs. Like one of the things is we probably do need to have a much greater area of land available, say in a place like Auckland and other growing cities like Christchurch as an example.
Then we move into infrastructure. We need to be able to have transportation and things to build out.
Yes, and one of the things is of course you can go and say, look, we've got 30 years supply of land all that will zone and make readily available, but unless some of that stuff is going to be buildable on in a short period of time because there is the infrastructure either in place or it's going to be put in place, you don't tend to have much of a contestable sort of pool of land to build on, and you're still artificially constraining that price of that land, and it's the biggest cost of providing new homes off on that land. And so where you can build, what you can build on it, the length of time it even takes to get consents, the certainty around that process, all those things have a really big influence on how quickly we can build homes and how cheap they are. So they're a big part of that process. There's lots of other things we can look at, but I really do think that if we need to get that cost of providing homes down, because we have very high house prices compared to our
across
incomes.
the world.
When you look at it across globally, and look, we've got, roughly what the UK's, I guess, area, landmass, and we've got, say, a Sydney-sized population, but we've got very high prices
That's
relative
wild,
to income.
In summary, I guess it is people and it is supply. I think those are the two really strong themes that have come through today. And in that people space, we spoke about the appetite for capital gains in New Zealand, and you talk about building up and versus land. And I think historically, there's been the Kiwi dream around the backyard and room to play. So I think the question will be whether with more migrants moving in, those sort of preferences change and develop, and then we can kind of potentially move more into, I guess, medium density housing. And then the other thing would be that supply, which I think you're just going to have to sort out, Nick. I'm not a builder.
Neither am I. You probably want me to build your house.
Yeah. Well, co-ownership, but I guess that's another way to look at it. And in a way it is similar to medium to density housing or, building up. It's about kind of taking up less space and sharing the allocation of resources or housing so that you've got multiple people owning a fraction in a property. What do you see about co-ownership and that potential role for the future of housing?
Well, I think it's something that can really help people get their foot in the door into a house. I suppose it's that halfway house between flatting with people and paying somebody some rent and actually owning your own home. You're actually sharing that ownership with other people. I suppose it's a bit like the way in these days where you can get sort of fractional ownership of shares as well. So you don't have to buy a sort of big lump. You can buy a much sort of smaller, affordable lump. So I sort of really do look at it, the work that you've been doing and enabling people to be able to get a foot into the property ladder and start to achieve one of their life goals through doing it. So I think what's really great to see is that we've got a lot more innovative in how we're looking at the solutions. So like your slice to buy, getting that share is one way. We're getting a lot more focus on sort of social housing development, rent to buy, all those sorts of schemes coming up where we are looking at ways where we can actually help people get into their own home over the longer term. And that's important for many ways. I think, one, I think just trying to figure out ways to make housing more affordable in different ways is really important. And just sort of socially, people having their own home, it provides so much more of an anchor. It gives a lot more stability. You become more integrated into your neighbourhood. Your kids, if you've got them, will be more settled in a school. You're not having to sort of shuffle around. There are a lot of sort of good social benefits from people being able to own their own home.
Yeah, absolutely. And to close off our episode today, thank you for joining us, Nick, but I have one last question for you. If someone were to visit you at your home and ring the doorbell and that doorbell played a theme song, what would it be?
Well, I actually have one of those musical doorbells
No,
where you can
don't.
change the theme on it. It was there, I stress it was there when I moved in. My girls love setting it on different things. So I think recently they set it on Happy Birthday because it happened to be someone's birthday. Someone was having their 40th for about the 13th time recently. And so it's Happy Birthday was what the doorbell was literally playing.
What a banger. Do you know what? It's a classic, Nick, and you've really probably brought it home by saying not only do I know the song, I actually have one of those. Thanks so much for joining us.
Pleasure. Thanks, Amy.
Thank you for joining our community. Buying property isn't easy, but listening in will get you one step closer on your journey. Please leave an Apple or Spotify review and provide feedback so we can improve your experience. Join our Facebook group, A Safe Space to Learn Together, or follow us on Instagram at Slice2Buy. If you have any questions or topics you would like us to touch on, you can email us at hello@slice2buy.com. A quick reminder, Slice the podcast does not provide personalised investment advice. We are not acting as financial advisors or taking into account your circumstances. To get personalised advice, join us at slice2buy.com and engage with our partners who can act as your financial advisor or lawyer and support you with your specific needs.